has Linux become too complicated and too limiting? That is the question. And I think undoubtedly for certain systems, yes. And certain others are designed in a way trying to embrace one of these concepts. Say, for example, with an immutable distro, this is trying to be limiting. But as a general idea, has Linux become too complicated and too limiting? Well, recently, Distrotube put out this video, and I've got some thoughts on it. I'm skipping the intro because it just doesn't matter. The important part starts about here.
Part of this is a lot of our free and open source software that we depend on, that we build our GNU/Linux distributions upon. A lot of these programs are now becoming so big and complicated that they become less user-friendly, they become harder to customize, they become in many ways less flexible, and because of that...
That's a pretty bold claim, but let's just see what examples he has in store.
That is not the ultimate hacker's paradise that it was 15 years ago. I just think it's lost some of that luster.
Okay.
Some good examples of how Linux was back in 2008 as far as being flexible and customizable, and you could easily hack on things, all these desktop environments and window managers. You had ultimate theming options. Is, you know, around 2008 or so when I first got into Linux, it was the Gnome 2 desktop.
Gnome is going to be a consistent thread throughout this video, and you'll see why in just a bit.
Those days with the GTK2 toolkit, and you had literally hundreds of GTK themes available to you on Linux, and every color scheme. You had some really crazy GTK themes. So if you go back and look at...
But has that really gone away? Like, just doing a quick search right now, just going onto something like gnomelook.org, that hasn't gone away. There's 1,500 themes here in basically any style you want. Do you want to use, what is this, Pink City? Let's go to page 6, for example. Let's grab, what is this, Gently Color. Let's go to page 10. Ultimate Maya, sure. All of these seem to me to be very different looking themes. And there's a lot of them here. Like, you can go through all these, you just keep going through these and going through these and going through these, and I don't think you'll ever run into two themes that are, you know, that similar. But anyway.
And look at some of the old screenshots of Linux 15 years ago, especially old GTK-based desktops 15 years ago. They were absolutely gorgeous. They were far better than what we have now, in my opinion. And part of this...
Let's go back and have a look at those screenshots for just a second. So we have this one
GTK
here.
Themes. So if you go back and look at...
Okay. We have this one here. This here, and the last one, that one. Maybe I'm the weird one here, but if I go over to Unix Porn right now, I don't think that's any different from the screenshots you see on this subreddit. Here is the top one for, is this today? It's a hot one today. This is Hyperland. Okay, let's have a look at that one. Here's some random other one. Here's Margaret Thatcher OS. Sure. These don't look any different from the screenshots he's showing. Like, sure, the specific styling is a little bit different, but they seem to be just as customized.
GTK2 Toolkit was the last time GTK was really simple and easy to use that anybody, you, me, anybody watching this video right now could easily make a GTK theme.
I've not made a GTK theme. I've not made one in GTK2. I wasn't around for GTK2. I'll just take his word for it that it was much simpler back then.
Just theme it with whatever color scheme you want, and you could put it out there for the world to use. And with GTK 3 and GNOME 3, that all went away. GTK 3 became such a complicated mess that pretty much everyone that was theming for GTK 2, most of them just didn't even try to theme for GTK 3.
Well, that's very possible. A lot of the old GTK 2 theme devs just aren't around anymore. But these aren't just GTK 3 themes. These are GTK 3 and GTK 4 themes. GTK 4, when it first came out and you were first starting to see libad waiter and things like that, had this idea in people's minds where it just wasn't going to be themable. It seems to be just as themable if you want to put that effort into actually getting the theming being done.
It was too much of a mess. It was too complicated. It was too hard to create a theme. And then if you went to the trouble to create a theme, the next version of GTK and the next version of Gnome would break your theme.
There's definitely an issue with themes breaking between versions. Absolutely.
Where you'd have to start all over and do the work all over again.
I would argue with starting all over, because if you look at the change history of these themes, usually they just have to make these little additions on each version. It's not like they delete the entire repo and start again.
And it's just a nightmare. It's a headache. And of course, now we have GTK 4. Pretty soon we're going to have GTK 5, and it's just becoming more and more complicated and more complex.
Once again, these are GTK 4 themes, so I just disagree.
And really, a lot of this,
maybe it's getting more complicated, but we still have the themes.
Gnome desktop environment, the Gnome developers, and GTK, they really just destroyed what was a beautiful thing with desktop Linux, and that was the fact that anyone could theme their Linux desktop.
Here is the main issue. If they destroyed it on GNOME. On the Linux desktop, they have not changed anything. Most of the people out there that are using GTK and they're not in GNOME are using GTK 3. Like, GTK 4 mainly only exists in that environment.
To just amazing potentials. I also remember the crazy desktop effects we had back then with the
This was in big part thanks to things like Compiz, but KDE has their own thing as well.
Cube and being able to draw fire on the screen, or to create rain puddles that are dropping on your desktop. And you had, when you close a window, you could make the window explode, or it would blow up in flames, or it would fold up into a paper airplane and fly off the screen. And back then, that was because we were still using Xorg. We are still using Xorg.
Xorg doesn't really have anything to do with it. In fact, if you want to have like fancy effects on your desktop, today, you're better off not using Xorg. Like, go check out projects such as Hyperland or Wayfire. These are Wayland compositors that implement a lot of the cool stuff that was available over on Compiz. Now, in the case of Hyperland, they're not going to be going as hard on that, but this is Wayfire. We have burning windows. We have the cube. And there's a bunch of other random things out there that no sane person's actually using on a day-to-day basis, but it is here if you really want to go and use it. Anyway, he gets into Compiz now.
Xorg for the most part these days, but you had, your standard compositors, and one of the very popular compositors back then was Compiz.
Absolutely. And
Compiz was a compositor that had all these amazing effects, and you typically back then you used the old GNOME 2 desktop environment in conjunction with the Compiz compositor to get just these amazing desktop effects that were truly world class. No other operator.
I wouldn't call them world class. I would call them gimmicky. And the reason why desktops got rid of them is most people just didn't care about them. Most people cared about things like transparency, blur, sliding windows, rounded corners. That's it. And when Compiz was gone, sure, some people were like a little bit disappointed about it, but it's not this major thing that people are clamoring towards, because if they were, they would be getting implemented in every one of the modern desktops. And the other thing about Compiz is Compiz hasn't actually gone away. You can still run Compiz right now. Yes, it's not going to work integrated into GNOME. That's true. I don't believe it will work integrated into most of the desktop environments, but it will work integrated into a window manager. You can still go and use it. You can still have wobbly windows and airplanes and, burning windows and all that fun stuff that you used to be able to do. The other problem that Compiz had is it was based on this really archaic way in Xorg of doing this rendering. And it was really inefficient. Like, if you want to talk about bloat, the way compiz used to work is basically the definition of bloat, and it was really inefficient. We're not talking like, you know, Vista and Aero, but still not great nonetheless. Anyway, compiz.
Operating system had the kind of desktop effects that Linux had back then, and I would argue today Linux doesn't have those desktop effects the way we had it 15 years ago. And the reason is because nobody's putting in that work anymore with these Xorg compositors.
Because no one wants it. That's why there's no work being done. No one wants it.
For the last 12 years or so.
Yes, I know there's going to be one person who's like, I want it, but you're the exception, not the rule.
People have been focused on working on Wayland, getting a new display server up, which is still...
I know this is kind of nitpicking, but Wayland is not a display server. Wayland is a protocol. The display servers are the compositors themselves, but moving on.
Oh, not even close to being ready yet. And of course, Wayland is much more complex in the way it does things, because now you don't create a desktop environment and a window manager. You create a Wayland compositor. Every Wayland window manager is essentially a compositor. It's a compositor and window manager all together, and it's a mess.
I would argue the problem isn't that Wayland is more complicated. The problem is that it is simpler. Wayland is not a display server. Wayland is not this thing that any window manager can just go and hook into, and then all of the complicated stuff is done. So you need to write that complicated stuff yourself, because Wayland is just the protocol. It's a much simpler way of approaching it.
One of the things back in the day, with Xorg on Linux, we have probably more than 100 different desktop environments and window managers to choose from. We have ultimate choice and just amazing variation between all of these desktop environments and window managers.
Do you really, though? Like, when we are talking about dynamic tiler number 1, dynamic tiler number 2, dynamic tiler number 50, yeah, they have different ways to configure them. But do they really have that much different? Sure, the desktop environments do. Like, Gnome is very clearly distinct from KDE. KDE is very clearly distinct from Cinnamon. But can you say the same thing about window managers? I just don't think that's the case. I think in window managers, as long as it's a dynamic tiler or a manual tiler, that's pretty much the major difference that matters. Some of them are a bit more configurable, some of them are less configurable. That's about as far as it goes. At least that's the way that I think about it.
With Wayland, we're not going to have probably any real variation, or it's going to be very limited. It's because it's so hard to create these Wayland window managers compared to how easy it is to create one.
Compositors, not window managers, but sure.
In Xorg, right? We're not going to have nearly as many window managers. Most of them, because of the amount of code and work involved, are simply going to, for the most part, be forks of each other, because it's just too complicated to start all over and do your own compositor, Wayland compositor, when somebody's already did one for this other window manager. So I'll just fork their window manager.
But what's wrong with that? I know that might sound weird, but what's wrong with that? If someone's already written a good base, like someone's already written River, someone's already written DWL, they've written Sway, and it does all of that core fundamental stuff, the stuff that every window manager is going to need to do anyway, what's wrong with forking off of that and adding the additions on top of that that make it do what you want it to do? Like Hyperland, for example. Hyperland isn't a fork of any one project, but Vaxry based the project on a bunch of different existing compositors, because why would you write something entirely from scratch if someone's already done it? Like, that's just a waste of time. Work smarter, not harder. But the other thing that a lot of people forget about is a lot of the environments we have on Xorg are forks already. Some of the most obvious examples are things like Cinnamon from Gnome, and many of the tilers out there are just DWM forks, and things like XFC and Enlightenment are forks of FVWM. Being a fork isn't a bad thing whatsoever, but it's probably fair to say that writing a WRoots compositor is more complicated than writing a XOR window manager, and that's due in part to the fact that WRoots isn't super well documented and is a really low-level library. I've done a video on this Reddit post ages back, but do keep in mind that you can write a Wayland compositor in only a couple hundred lines. This is tiny WL. Most of the file is comment, and it's only 900 lines long. I got a little bit sidetracked there. Let's go back to this.
It's not going to be the same, right? And it bothers me. It really bothers me how this new technology, these new desktop environments, these new theming toolkits, the new display server, new audio servers with, ALSA and then Pulse and then Pipewire that are all just hacks that get stacked on top of each other.
ALSA is still the kernel level audio. ALSA replaced something known as OSS, which I want to say is Open Sound System. Someone's going to correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then later down the line, Pulse Audio came around to basically make ALSA easier to interact with, and now Pipewire basically is this meta management daemon, not just managing Pulse Audio, but also managing ALSA, GStreamer, Jack, and these other audio systems that exist under Linux. Also, originally, Pipewire was going to be called Pulse Video, so it manages the video stream aspect that you need on something like Wayland.
It's becoming a mess, and Linux on the desktop really has become, again, so complicated and so inflexible that it's really hard to be that tinkerer. Back in the day.
Your channel's about being a tinkerer, though.
You could take these pieces and rearrange them and put them back together. Again, you could get in the config files, you could hack on things, and you could just do some amazingly creative stuff with Linux. And you can still do that for the most part on Linux, but it's not the same, right? It's becoming much more of a rigid ecosystem, and it troubles me. Now,
right, but you don't have to use any of that stuff that troubles you. You don't have to use Gnome. You don't have to use KDE. You can use a window manager and pick and choose all of these different pieces that, fit the workflow that you want to have. Config files haven't gone anywhere. You literally edit config files in your videos on multiple times a week. You've done streams editing config files, so how is it not the same? Yes, there are certain aspects of Linux where, they don't have that same level of freedom, but just don't use them.
A lot of the lower level Linux utilities, especially like the GNU core utils and things like that, once you get into the command line stuff, all of that stuff is still very simple. It's all small, modular tools. For the most part, these small tools, they do one job, they do one thing well, and they have the ability to pipe their output as input into the next command, so you can pipe things into it. And at the command line, we still have that ultimate flexibility and customization. We have ultimate power. But
I think that's absolutely true, but I would argue that having that flexibility, having that power, does make things more complicated. By limiting what's available in these GUI applications, you are making it far, far less flexible, without a doubt, and if you want to have that full control, doing it from the terminal is the best way. But building up these chains to do things which in a GUI would be a single button press, without a doubt, is more complicated.
Once you get more into, especially the desktop RAM, once you get into user interface stuff, especially user interfaces that are designed for being new user friendly, a lot of that stuff has had their power stripped away, right? You're no longer able to do as much with these new desktop environments, and in some cases, these new programs that crop up. One of the things...
Good. Some of these things should have their power stripped away. Now, hear me out. What is wrong with a desktop that decides to cater to new users? I know that everyone watching this channel is, big, strong, advanced Linux user. We run window managers. We like to hack on things, and that's totally great. But what's wrong with having a system that's not catered towards you, that is catered towards those people that don't care about hacking on their system? They just want something that works. They want to have that, like, macOS experience, but it's on Linux instead. I'd argue there's nothing at all wrong with that, much like there is nothing wrong with a system targeting users like us that is a more complex system, like a Hyperland, for example. Not everything has to be for you, and there's always going to be those systems out there which you can hack on and make them work the way that you want them to work. You have this freedom on Linux to use something else if the thing that you're using doesn't fit what you want.
One of the biggest programs on Linux nowadays is systemd.
Systemd is not a program, it's a suite of programs.
D, of course, is
literally separate binaries.
Is the init system on most Linux distributions, although it's much more than an init system. It's actually an entire suite of applications.
Wow.
The init system is actually a really, really small part of systemd.
Impressive.
And that's because systemd includes things like systemd timers and all the networking stuff. And, systemd has, a bajillion components to it, right? The init part of it, again, is just a very small part. And why does that need to be the case? Couldn't you have all of that split up? Now, I don't mind systemd. Systemd.
Why? Let's just assume for a second that systemd wasn't a single project. It functioned the exact same way, but all of the different applications in systemd were separate projects with different names. They all just functioned the exact same way. What's the difference? Literally nothing. If the end result is exactly the same, why does it matter that they're not split up? I don't really understand. Anyway.
Actually works, and I will give systemd credit as far as to the end user. Systemd is actually pretty user-friendly as far as how you interact with it. In many cases, systemd is actually a little more user-friendly than some of the other alternative init systems, especially some of the older ones that systemd was created to replace, such as sys5 init and upstart. But really, the point of this little rant that I'm going on today, this is just me in a therapy session. You guys are the psychiatrists or the psychologists.
I'm not a very good psychiatrist or psychologist. I'm just going to make things worse for you.
This is me laying on a couch, giving you my thoughts here. Is I don't like the direction that so many of these free software projects are going. They're making these pieces of software that are just very rigid and very limiting, and it is completely changing GNU/Linux as we knew it. Many of us fell in love with Linux because of that customization and that extensibility, and that's really lacking in a lot of modern software projects. And again, I know I'm
right, but that's only really true if we're talking about GNOME. GNOME is supposed to be the simple desktop. Yes, there was a time when it was a lot more, fun to customize it, but that was never the end goal of GNOME. GNOME is trying to be that, Windows, that macOS experience on Linux. If you want more customization, use window managers, use KDE. Both of these you've used before, and for these systems, it's just completely untrue. And I know that you know this. This is not a video about Linux, it's just a video about GNOME. I know you put GNOME in the title here, but it's not Linux that's become more complicated and limiting, it's just GNOME. Now, over the next few minutes, he just explains how he uses this system, things like that. I'm just going to skip ahead to 12:20 here.
Free and open source software is I want to be able to hack on it. If I can't do what I want to do with your particular piece of software, the fact that it's free and open source, well, that's great. I love that it's licensed that way. But if I can't really do what I want to do, if I can't make it into what I want to make it into, what's really the difference between your free software project and a proprietary software project? It's really, other than the license, it's essentially becomes the same thing. Now, maybe that's just me being pessimistic. Maybe I think it is.
the fact that the source code is available means that you can hack on it. Part of that section that I skipped on is where he discusses dmenu, and the suckless utilities, by this definition of not having config files, things like that, they have no customization. None at all. You customize them by changing the source code. So is DWM no better than a proprietary project because you can't modify it? No, that just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't have a configuration system exposed, which I think it should. Having a nice configuration system exposed always makes things nicer, but saying it's equal to proprietary software just doesn't make any sense. And not everyone out here is using Linux for the same reason. Some people are using Linux because they just simply don't like Windows. Want to use Linux? Go ahead. Maybe you want to use it as a dev environment, and maybe you want to use it as a tinkerer and mess around with your system, getting into the weeds. I think all these people have a place on Linux, and different developers and different projects are going to accommodate different people. And if you don't like things getting more limited, stop looking at Gnome and look at things where they are catering towards the tinkerers. But what do you guys think? Do you think DT is making a good argument about the general state of Linux, or do you think this really only applies to Gnome and maybe a couple of other desktop environments, but everything else is still just as creative and just as free as it pretty much always has been? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go and like the video, and if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon Scribes Daily Bearer Pay link down below. That's gonna be it for me, and eventually I'm gonna join DT. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe there's a little bit of a bold patch forming there. One day I will be bold too. Bye bye.